All right. Well, hey, welcome everybody. This week we are going to begin speaking on interpersonal relationships. This is a key week because a big part of our communication is between those that we have relationships with. And those relational dynamics change per person and who we're interacting with and kind of the context that we're in. So it's important to understand the various different dynamics because it plays such a key role into just our quality of life and everything in that regard. So um, we're going to begin by talking about why our relationships matter, why they're important to us, and why study it. Then we're going to look at coming together and growing apart within our relationships. Um, and then we talk about some of the characteristics of friendship. So when we look at why we need relationships, we can begin by looking at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So when we look at this, it kind of breaks down what our needs are as a person. And, the base level here, the physiological needs are it's important for us to have our immediate needs met, which means food, water, warmth, rest, that kind of stuff. So we need those basic needs to be able to kind of grow within our self-growth. So after that, the next thing will be then we need security and safety. So after we have food and water and a place to sleep, well, then we need to be able to make sure that we have our safety needs met. Once we feel safe and secure in those senses, then we can move on into building relationships, friendships, and kind of those intimate bonds that we have, start to build upon those social needs that we have. Now, you'll notice that these build on one another. So we can't be able to focus on building relationships if our safety needs or our physiological needs aren't met. Meaning that if we don't have those core needs met, it's hard for us to focus on our relationships. And so if you look inside your own lives, or maybe some of the lives that you know of others, for those people that are maybe aren't have food insecurity, or don't have a safe place to live, or feel like they're in some sort of situation that they feel unsafe in, well, likelihood of them having any strong relationships or being able to attend to those are very low because their focus is going to be on those immediate basic needs. So it's important to take care of those basic needs first, and then after that, we can build into our intimate relationships. After that, then goes into what Maslow identifies as our esteem needs, which is building a sense of accomplishment. We're working on things once we feel loved and belongingness in our social networks, then we can feel like we can strive to accomplish things. And then the self-actualization step is finding the ability to reach your full potential. So this includes just the core aspects of your life, those guiding principles that you have, to really tap into some of like your creative side of things, but just really finding out who it is you are as a person. And so it's important to understand this hierarchy so you can identify certain things and figure out where you're at as far as building relationships. So when we look at why relationships matter, we can look towards what psychologist Roy Baumeister says, which is the need to belong theory that he created. And essentially what it means is that each of us are born with the drive to seek, form, maintain, and protect strong social relationships. We all have this innate desire within us to connect with other people. We want to feel like we have some sort of belongingship. So that could be a social clique, that could be a family group, that could be a friendships, that could be at a workplace. We have that desire to want to belong because we are social creatures. Our species has survived over time because of our ability to communicate and grow those relationships. We have a pack mentality when it comes to that. And so that is in a biological sense built within us. There are three rewards that come with our social relationships. On one hand, they have emotional rewards, so we get to be able to feel supported and encouraged. We have people support us when maybe you're going through a hard time, but you get those emotional needs kind of met through our social relationships. But you could also gain on like a material side of things. So these could be, maybe you have a strong network when it comes professionally, or at your work, you have the relationships that you have. Or even within family or friends group, it's where you share resources with one another. This is where the term, it's not what you know, but who you know, comes into play. You're more likely to get a job if you know somebody who works there, and they could be that kind of connection person for you, than if you knew nobody. Same thing kind of goes here with our relationships. When we are in relation with one another, we like to share our resources with someone. So these could be something like financially, but it could also be just opportunities. It could be experiences like, hey, I got an extra ticket to this concert, I'd love to bring you with. So these are ways that our relationships can kind of bring rewards. On the other hand is also our health rewards. So when we are in healthy relationships and we are connected within a social group, our physical health begins to improve. And that is really backed well with research. I will, within this module, I'll actually post another video. It's a TED Talk by a researcher at Harvard University. And he's in charge of the longest standing study when it comes into terms of looking at people's life and the quality of life. And they tried to look at what factors determine what makes a healthy life. And relationships have been the number one factor to contribute towards a good life. So if you want to live a good life, be in social relations with others. So when we look at our relationships, to understand what attracts us to one another, you kind of want to, there's a couple different factors that come into play here. So appearance has a big part of this. So this is early on in the early stages, is where it's most important. And this is just where when you first meet someone or you first see someone, there's that initial level of attraction based solely off of the appearance of the other person. So this is not, obviously this is true in like an intimate relationship, like maybe you have you think somebody's cute, or you like who they are and you want to maybe try to explore an intimate relationship with them. Well, then, there's that side of it. But also the appearance goes into like even just acquaintances and friendships and kind of those other types of relationships. We base it off of, okay, what kind of clothes are you wearing? How you kind of present yourself, so to say. And so those appearances are a big piece in that early stage. After that, once the relationship starts to build a little bit, you start to talk with one another. We are attracted to people who share similarities with us. So we want to, connect with people who have similar interests, similar ways of being able to communicate, maybe similar like context in the sense of like where they are or where they like to frequent. So for instance, if you're talking and you find out both of you like the same sports team, well, that might be a way for you to connect. And then you talk about the players or some of the history or stats or something along those lines. You may even find, even through some of those early conversations, that, oh, you go to the same places I do. You go to the same restaurants, or you go to maybe some of the same hangout places. Oh, that's great. Let's talk about that. So you could really start to build that bond based off of not only the appearances initially, but then also basing it off of some of the similarities that you share. But it's not just all about what's similar. There's also the parts that complement us. We as humans appreciate when people are different. We wouldn't want just everyone to be the same, or else it'd just be us hanging out with ourselves constantly. And so while, yes, we are attracted to people that share similarities, we also are attracted to people that complement ourselves. So if maybe we have a particular strength and someone has an area of maybe some sort of weakness, well, we can complement each other there. Especially if they also have a strength in some other area, and then you may not be having, that might not be your strong suit. Well, you can complement one another, and then you are better together. This works both in like an actual relationship, as far as you and like a spouse or a partner, but it also could just be within friendships. I have friends that are vastly different than myself, yet the way that we communicate and the type of person they are complements me. And so this is something that could actually strengthen that relationship solely based off of those differences. And then there's this aspect of reciprocal attraction. So which means that we like it when people like us. We like the people who like us. It feels good when somebody actually likes us. And so this is a tendency that we like to be around people who like to be around us. And so it's kind of like this reciprocal circular process that kind of takes place. And when that happens, when people who make us feel like they like us and accept us for who we are, it boosts our self-esteem. So this is a really positive thing, but it could also be a negative thing. Maybe you're around a crowd that doesn't, that supports you living a lifestyle that maybe isn't so healthy for yourself. And so they may, fuel you and make you feel good and say, oh yeah, no, that's okay. Keep doing what you're doing. But it could actually drag you down. And so that is something to kind of pay attention to, is that sometimes we find those relationships that make us feel good, yet they're maybe not the best for us, simply because they are approving of maybe some sort of bad habits or some sort of bad behaviors we fall into. And so, yes, it might feel good for this reciprocal attraction, yet you kind of want to analyze that and make sure that that's takes place in a healthy manner. Other components that attract us is competence. So we like to be around people who are talented. We like people who can do things, who are interesting, who are skilled in certain areas or have certain interests or knowledgeable in certain ways. And so people who are competent, we tend to be attracted to, especially if it's in an area that we are familiar with or highly interested in. And so, for instance, you might be really into into the music scene or something along those lines. Well, you're going to be attracted to other people who are talented musically and who perform well. There is a flip side to that. Sometimes if somebody is too talented, maybe they're well beyond like a skill level that you have currently, that can make you feel insecure. And this happens to all of us. It makes us all feel insecure to be around people who are maybe too talented in a certain area. And so there's two aspects of that. Maybe that could be a negative sense of like, okay, this person makes me feel bad, so I don't want to be around them. But it could also be a way for maybe that could lead into some sort of like mentorship or coaching opportunity. Finally, there's this sense of self-disclosure. And we've talked about this a lot throughout this course yet. Self-disclosure is a big part of us being able to connect with other people. When we reveal information about ourselves, it could lead towards other people liking us, but we also like it when other people reveal information about themselves. The more and more that we reveal about one another, the closer that relationship can bond. Yet you have to be careful, because if you do it too early in the relationship, or you maybe dump too much information, that could actually lead to someone being put off by that. Think about when maybe you've conversated with somebody and they dumped a whole life story on you the second you met them. It could be a little off-putting, because it's a lot to take in and they've skipped the steps needed. We will dive into in just here in a couple slides the process in which a relationship builds. And if you jump ahead too quickly, sometimes that could be detrimental to that relationship. Not all the time. Sometimes you could do that. Sometimes there's just those people that you click with immediately and you just have that level of trust right off the bat, and that you can share and you self-disclose in this way. But oftentimes we want to be careful with how much we share at one time. Usually it's something that takes place over time. And so you want to also think about what attracts us. So for instance, there's the concept of proximity. So we tend to build relationships with people that we're around. Think about, in the classroom, for instance, you begin to build relationship with your classmates because you happen by circumstance to be put in the same class. Our work relationships are the same way. You sign on in a new job, you get to know these people, and just because of the circumstances that you are in, you happen to work at the same place at the same time. Well, then that proximity has built, you build this relationship with them. And because you're kind of, in a sense, forced together, because outside of this situation, you wouldn't be around each other, then you begin to share information with one another. And certain people you may cling on to and you really click with. And then that's the people that you kind of can build further relationship with outside of that situational relationship. And then some people stay within the situational relationship. It just kind of depends, and the willingness on both parties. And there's a big part to our rewards in our relationship. So when we interact with one another, we do so in a rewards basis, meaning that, you know, the reward we receive from the relationship needs to be greater to or equal to the cost of the relationship. And so to put that into kind of a framework here, relationships take time, it takes effort, it takes even some of our resources. And so in a sense, all relationships cost us something. It could cost us just merely our time and interacting with one another. It could cost us our attention. Sometimes it costs you, like if you have to help somebody move, that's your effort that you're putting in. Or sometimes it's monetary, where you actually have to, you want, like certain people you like support. Like for instance, my kids, you know, I support them financially, but also in a social sense and relationally and emotionally and in so many different aspects. And so depending on the relationship, there's different types of rewards that you get. We tend to gravitate towards relationships that we get rewards back equal to or greater to our cost. So think about this. You have a friend and, you know, it's just lighthearted. And every time you get together, it doesn't take a lot of effort and you guys just click and there's not a lot of maintenance because you guys don't fight a whole lot. And, you know, it's just somebody who you really feel good when you're around. Those are relationships that are highly rewarding and don't cost a whole lot. And so those are ones that we tend to keep around, because when you hang out with them, you get your emotional or your social cup filled. Yet it doesn't take a whole lot of effort outside of just the time of you being with them. Some relationships, on the other hand, they take a lot of maintenance to keep going. Maybe there's some drama that's involved, or there's situations that you constantly have to tend to, and these things, and they take place. And, you know, at times, all relationships will end up maybe costing more than what you're getting as a reward right then and there. And that doesn't necessarily mean a negative thing. But over time, when you see and you look at the bigger picture, if there are some of those relationships that seem to be draining us more than they're filling us, those could be things that we tend to shy away from. And those are the relationships that we tend to distance from. And then we look at how we come together and how our relationships grow, and then how they maybe separate and fall apart. And so there's this kind of life cycle that our relationships go through, and each one tends to fall within a different realm. And so understanding how that takes place will allow us to better understand how to navigate those relationships and to keep them in the healthy zone. So Knapp was a professor at the University of Texas, and he built together this model of how relationships transpire and how they grow over time and maybe disintegrate. So initially, you'll see that there's this initiating stage, and it begins to grow and grow in more intensity until you get into this relational status where it requires relational maintenance. These are your actual relationships that take a lot of your attention, so they're the close people around you. And then if relationship, for whatever reason, it could be conflict, it could be growing apart, it could be just many different ways, begins to lower. You begin to come apart. And so we'll look at each one of these stages in a little bit more detail. And here's just another slide here to kind of show how this takes place. So in the initiating stage, this is where you first get to meet someone. It's the first impression. It's, there's some sort of level of attraction that takes place between you and this other person. You, for whatever reason, whether it's proximity, whether it is just by chance, you have met this other person. And so usually in this stage, communication is typically just fairly brief. It's something that takes place shortly. It's just an initial, hey, how are you? And then it usually follows that conventional formula, which we talked about in our conversations module. And so after you've initially met somebody, and you've had that first interaction, typically takes place in some sort of small talk, then we begin to experiment with this person. And what that means is we begin to interact in a relationship by asking questions. And the reason we ask questions with this other person is to reduce uncertainty. We want to get to know this person and realize and figure out if there's somebody we want to invest our time in to build a relationship, or if it's somebody that we want to avoid. And so this is something that takes place after the initial contact. And then we begin to get to know who they are. You maybe ask some of their interests, maybe you get to know a little bit about them. And through this discovery process, you may identify, okay, cool, this is somebody that has some sort of interest for me. I would like to continue to get to know them. Then, if that's the case, you would move into the intensifying stage. And this is where an actual relationship, an actual interpersonal relationship begins to build. This is where you start to get to know the person. You begin to know a little bit about their feelings and and who they are, and a little bit more. They begin to self-disclose a tiny bit, and you get to know little bits and pieces about them, and that relationship really starts to intensify. From there, if it continues, this is where you actually build some sort of solid relationship with this person. Okay, we're friends, or okay, we're, you actually begin to identify with this person or persons. And so this could be something like, oh, this is just my work clique. We're the group of people that we really just, every time we work together, we're just our best buds. This could be something like in a classroom, if you've got a group project, these are the people that you've now formed some sort of group, you've formed together as a group that you will take on a project together. This could be your friend group that you have that you and it could be one person or it could be many, but you begin to build that relationship. And it starts by you take on each other's commitments, which means like you begin to exchange like our time. This will be something like you would then commit to one another that you're going to meet for coffee or drinks or something along those lines. Or it might be something like, hey, I got a game, our band is performing, I'd like you to come. Now, all of a sudden, there's that commitment that they're going to come to that event. Or, oh, I have a soccer game, I'd like for you to come and watch. Okay, well, then there's that level of commitment. And so the commitment levels that vary depending on the type of relationship and the context, but you really begin to form that relationship. And then you'll fall into the bonding stage. And this is where you reach the point where now it's time to make it Facebook official, right? This is where you make a public gesture towards this person. And so, for instance, in a relationship, an intimate relationship that you would have with somebody, well, then you would maybe say, oh, we're boyfriend and girlfriend. Or it could be even something like like in an engagement, or it could be we are in a relationship with one another. And so that would be that public gesture that you would make for that. But it could also just be for like in the sense of like a friendship. It could be like, oh no, we're friends, or we're best friends, or oh yeah, that is my my friend. And then you begin to make a commitment with that person. And then you're tied to them. So now your identity is kind of tied with this other person in a sense. And so you've made that real true bond where connecting one another. And so then you'd fall into here when you're at that stage and you've grown to, and when you're at this stage, and I would say here, when you're at like the bonding or even the integrating stage, you go back, you want to participate in relational maintenance. And this is where you actually where you're constantly tending to this relationship. All relationships that we have in our life require some sort of maintenance. When we look at here, if we're in our maybe the initiating or experimenting, even some of our intensifying stages, you don't necessarily have to maintain those relationships. They're just kind of taking place in our life. They're just things that happen. And if we choose to take them to further stages in the relationship, then yes, maintenance will be needed. But at those current stages, not a whole lot of maintenance is needed. But now you've gotten into a closer relationship and you're choosing to actually maintain that relationship. You're going to have to put in some effort. Some effort is going to have to take place on both your end and on their end, and it has to be a reciprocal process here. But the intentional maintenance is needed to be able to continue this on. And so some of these would go down to like positivity, which means that you need to have a positive impact in this person's life. If this relationship is something that is constantly negative, constantly destructive, or just as something that doesn't build to the positivity of the other person's life, it will begin to fall into some of the coming apart stages, which we'll explain a little bit later. And we're not going to go over every one of these little relationship maintenance things. Look into them as you go. But you need to tend to these things. Relationship talks are things where you check in with the person. Hey, how are you doing? How do you feel things are between us? Is there anything that, maybe you would express that, hey, I need for you to show up more on time. Every time we hang out, you tend to be 10, 15 minutes late. It's just disrespectful for me. These are those types of relationship talks that you might have. They can be more on the minor end, or they could be more on the bigger side of things. But then there has to be like a level of acceptance as well. If you don't accept this person as who they are, or they don't accept you, then there's going to be a little bit of tension in that relationship and it'll begin to fall apart. Now, that does not mean you have to accept everything about this person and that you can't challenge them to grow or to improve. But the overall part of the relationship, that there has to be this overall feeling of acceptance for it to flourish. Sharing tasks could be something that actually takes place, like where you actually you continue to do things. Like, for instance, a friend moves, you help move their stuff out as they move into a new apartment. Well, then the expectation might fall back, and when you move, they would then come and help you as well. So these are kind of things that you could use and do to continuously tend to these relationships. Now, if maybe the maintenance isn't taking place, or if something happens in the relationship, like an actual critical event, or if maybe the time isn't being spent to it, you can begin to fall apart in your relationship. And when that takes place, it begins in the differentiating stage. And this is where your identity then moves from a we to an I. You stop saying, oh, we go out to eat at this place every Tuesday, or we are really close, or we are, this and that. And then it begins to shift to the I. You've now kind of begin to dissociate from the togetherness of this. Because there's some sort of tension in this relationship, it's no longer a we. It's more like, oh, I will meet up with this person on Tuesday, or I, this, and that. And so you'll see a little bit of that verbiage change there. And this usually occurs when the relationship experiences its first feelings of stress. And so what that means, there's a conflict, right? You have some sort of disagreement with this person, or something external happens and is impacting the relationship. Most of the time, in a lot of our relationships, in all relationships, there's going to be some sort of conflict. And so you may fall into this little differentiating stage and then bounce back into the more healthy stages. Yet, but if that doesn't take place and it begins to continue to shift towards the coming apart, then you fall into the circumscribing. And this is where the communication begins to really decrease in both quantity and quality. So quantity would be the amount of time that you actually spend talking with one another. If this person was somebody you texted every day, or saw in person every day, well, then maybe it comes down to maybe you're texting once a week. Maybe even further, it goes down to once a month or something along those lines. But then also the quality, how deep is that conversation? How much is taking place? The type of topics that you're talking about. If it begins to fall apart, you'll see that kind of decrease on both of those ends. And then each party will begin to build sort of restrictions or restraints to the relationship. So going back to the topics discussed, you may not talk about all the things you used to talk about. Or you may put restrictions on how much time you spend with this person. If it begins to continue, if it continues to fall apart, then what you'll see is it enters a stagnation stage. And this is where no growth occurs. It just lies stagnant. You're not bouncing back into another, like a previous stage. There's no maintenance being taken on these stages. It just begins to kind of stagnate. And this is where as some would describe it, as a hollow shell of its former self. So you used to have this relationship, and while it's still kind of there, it's not what it used to be. There's some sort of emptiness to it, and you really it isn't as full as it once was. After enough time in that stagnation stage, it will begin to fall into the avoiding stage. You can't stay in that stagnation for too long, and eventually it becomes something where you want to, because it's kind of uncomfortable in that stagnation stage, parties will begin to distance themselves from one another. And this will be like a physical distance. So if you happen to be in the same place, maybe you're in a classroom, for instance, right? You would sit at opposite sides of the room. When before you would sit right next to each other. But it could also be things like online. You just distance yourself in the sense of you don't comment on the same pages that they comment on, or you no longer are responding to their texts. If you had a group chat, maybe the group chat disperses, and then all of a sudden, it begins to become this kind of avoidance thing. And sometimes this takes place indirectly or directly. So directly will just be a straight up, like, I see this person at the grocery store, I'm going to turn and go down a different aisle. That's a direct way of avoiding someone. But indirectly could just be something that maybe you're in a group setting and you just aren't talking to the person. And so that's kind of more so on that end. Eventually, to come down to the terminating stage. And this is where the relationship ends. This is where you actually have a dialogue with the other person saying this can no longer take place. This is something that just, it's no longer a relationship that's going to be had. It doesn't always reach the actual dialogue. Sometimes it's a ghosting situation where you just don't talk to the person anymore. But in a healthy manner, hopefully there'll be some sort of dialogue to add to that closure. And keep in mind, it doesn't always end up in a straight line towards this stage. It doesn't just like, when we look at the model here, I'm going to go back. We hit the differentiating stage. Don't panic and think, it's immediately going to go into terminating. That's just not how relationships are. Far more complex than what this little diagram can demonstrate. This does a great job, but it can't tell everything. And so the important piece to know that is that when you fall into a stage, you can move backwards or you can move forward. And so it takes your intentional effort and the intentional effort of the other person or persons to engage in that process of relational maintenance to move it back to a healthy standpoint. And so the hope is that if you do fall into maybe a differentiating or circumscribing, there is still time within those stages to be able to move it back to the healthy place. That'll take intentional conversations. The book that we read earlier, Crucial Conversations, is a really good opportunity for you to kind of get a little bit of practice on that. But here you get to see why it's so important that we maintain these relationships. Because once it falls into stagnation or below, it becomes far harder to move it back into a healthy place. It's not impossible, but it takes a lot more effort. And so now that you know that the kind of the process in which this takes place and some of the characteristics of building and maintaining relationships, analyze your own relationships. If you try to, determine where your relationships fall in this model. Are there any relationships that are falling into the coming apart stage? And are you okay with that? And if you're not, what can you do to help maintain that? What can you do to kind of bring it back to a healthy standpoint? The biggest thing we can do is communicate with the other people. The other people that are involved with our relationships, the best thing we can do is sit down and have a healthy dialogue with them in hopes to kind of maintain that. And if that's reciprocated and they want that same intention, then through that dialogue, you can figure out what those areas of conflict are and how to mediate that. So thank you very much for tuning into this video. I look forward to hearing a little bit more about your experiences with this in the reflection post. If you have any questions, please reach out. Thank you very much.